Hi, everyone. While we're waiting for people to join us, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Give us your name, if you want to give us your organization, maybe your country. Give us your name, your organization, where you're located, so we can see everybody who's with us in the room. We have New York City here, which is great. And Dr. Gussman. Monique, can you move her into our panelist room? Ah, great, wonderful. We have Paris, France. You're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat to everybody. Yay, from Turkey, Baha'i office, wonderful, welcome. We're going to give people a few more minutes to join us here. Monique, do we have everyone in our panelist room that we need there? We have the Coalition for CEDAW here, thank you. New York City again. Canada, perfect. Vienna, welcome to Vienna. And we see some of our colleagues here. One more minute, and then we are going to start our great program. So welcome everyone to the event entitled Gender Justice for the UN Decade of Action and the Generation Equality Forum. This meeting is taking place as a parallel event to the CSW 65. My name is Soon-Young Yoon, the UN representative for the International Alliance of Women and one of the co-drivers of the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan, along with Melissa Upreti and Krishanti Damaraj, the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University. Thank you for joining us. We're going to focus on strategic actions as a follow-up to the UN 75 declaration, looking forward to the Beijing Plus 25 Generation Equality Forum and the UN Decade of Action, which deals with the Sustainable Development Goals. An outcome report will be drafted by our colleagues and shared so that those the results of today will be fed into those processes. Thank you to Monique, Rory, Jeff, Fergus, and Yasmina, our conference team that helped put this event together. We welcome those of you who are watching on live stream on YouTube. If you're in our Zoom room, that's wonderful. You'll be able to participate in our chat. So in 1995, I was one of the organizers of the NGO Forum in Beijing at the Women's Conference. And at that time, I had many conversations with Ida Gonzalez, who was former chair of the CEDAW committee. Now, as I recall, Ida was one of the people who organized the very first UN World Conference on women in Mexico. So whenever anyone asks me, what was the impact of the 1995 conference? I always tell them you can't start there for Beijing 25. You really have to look back to the very first one held in 1975. So fortunately today we have someone with us who also knows that history. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Nadine Gassman from Mexico. She is president of the National Institute for Women, and I believe we call her the Mexico's ambassador to the Generation Equality Forum. Anyway, she's there at all of the meetings. She has been the director of the General Secretary's campaign, Join to End Violence Against Women, for the Latin American and Caribbean region, and also represented UN Women and UNFPA in the same region. She holds a doctoral degree in public health from the US, from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Gassman, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sunyu, for your introduction, for the acknowledgement of one of our icons, Aida Gonzalez, which was so important in crafting, I would say, the first conference on women. I want to say good morning to everyone, to say I'm really happy to be in this meeting, and start by acknowledging that the pandemic has been a stress test for multilateralism and for gender equality. 26 years after the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action, we are undergoing a very difficult time. And for this very reason, today, more than ever, we must fight to generate spaces for dialogue like this roundtable. The UN 75th Political Declaration lays out 12 distinct commitments to action, seeking to reinvigorate multilateralism on a global scale. The document includes a commitment to gender equality, underscoring that, and I quote, conflicts will not be resolved and sustainable development does not occur without the equal and active participation of women at all levels. And we have to say it over and over and over because some people just don't want to listen. Women are struggling in the fight for justice and equality to achieve gender justice. We need to communicate and collaborate, recognize our differences, our diversity and experiences. It is a great opportunity to once again touch base with civil society and leaders from social movements so their voices may help us chart the path forward with innovative proposals and clear actions. Only with the active and equal participation of activists, organizers, youth leaders in decision-making spaces can we hope to create a coherent roadmap for justice and equality. We need to improve and implement as far as we can all instruments in our power to promote inclusive development, decent work, protection, as well as strengthening social services, participation, and gender-responsive institutions, among other important issues to achieve fairer societies and eradicate violence. I want to share a phrase from Hermila Galindo, who was the first Mexican woman to run as candidate for federal Congress and who inspired us to fight for the world and the country we want to live. She said, and I quote, "I became revolutionary by the irresistible force of conviction, by a powerful impulse on duty, and by a great love for my people." During this session and in the days leading up to the Generation Equality Forum, an event jointly organized by UN Women, the government of Mexico and France, with civil society and youth, we celebrate that we're still standing, showing that we can and we want to raise our voices. Next week, in a week exactly, the Generation Equality Forum in Mexico will place women and girls' rights agenda at the forefront of the global conversation by centering the voices of grassroots organizations. It is conceived as an accelerator for social change and accountability. The forum offers a new way to join our voices, a horizontal space where diverse feminist movements of all generations come together with governments, international organizations, and the private sector to achieve the equality that women and girls deserve. The Generation Equality Forum, at its core, has sought to empower youth and youth leadership. In a groundbreaking experiment in co-creation, we have attempted to listen to the contribution of young women and men who are part of the Generation Equality Youth Task Force, as well as the constituencies they represent, to have their voices reflected in decision-making groups, as well as content-building spaces for the forum in Mexico. The exchanges around the forum and all the efforts surrounding the preparation have been edifying and constructive. The spirit of co-creation has found itself at the center of the forum, but now it's time for action. We need to move from theory to practice. We applaud the effort of the Coalition for the UN We Need, as well as the Feminist and Women Movement Action Plan, and welcome everybody to this roundtable. We need to believe in our words and in our actions, but we also need to believe in this dialogue because they themselves are the revolution. Thank you for all your hard work and your support to see you, and we hope to see you very soon in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Dr. Guzman, can I ask you to add one thing? Can you tell everyone what the dates of the forum are? And I can put in the chat later the registration. Is it open to everyone?
It is open to everybody. You are most welcome. The forum will be from March 29 to March 31st in Mexico, and then 2 months later, June 29, it will go to Paris. We would like you to put the registration, and we welcome everybody. And I also want to say we're making a big effort to have a program that follows the sun. So people both in the Western and Eastern Hemisphere can participate at hours that are decent hours. So please join us from around the world. Please be part of this conversation, and let's go and have actions because it's an action-oriented program.
Thank you. And just to reiterate, this is a virtual conference. So don't show up in Mexico because she may not even be there. So wonderful. It's open. And in a few minutes, I will put the registration for that in the chat. Now let me introduce our co-moderator, Dan Perrell. Dan is the UN representative of the Baha'i International Community's UN office. Dan is a lawyer who has worked in Indonesia, Marshall Islands, Chile on human rights and humanitarian affairs. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sun-Yung. And I don't think I've been called a lawyer in many, many years, but I appreciate the backhanded compliment. I did attend law school, but that's about as far as I can say I'm a lawyer. So good day to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. A special thanks, of course, to Sun-Yung and the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan, as well as the Coalition for the United Nations We Need, United Nations We Want, sorry, for the opportunity to spend some time together today. I'd also like to add my gratitude to Sun-Yung for those excellent framing remarks from Dr. Guzman. And we wish you and the Generation Equality Forum team in Mexico a wonderful event. And I'd like to just highlight the spirit of co-creation you've described. It's a really wonderful example of the kind of leadership that humanity needs, one that channels rather than dictates, and one that empowers rather than dominates. And I also thought that that quote you shared was phenomenal, and hopefully this irresistible force of conviction, of duty and love can really drive these efforts forward. And I would like to emphasize this dimension of love because I think it's something that's perhaps unmentioned, but it really is representative of what we need to channel at this moment when there is so much suffering ongoing around the world. So we are here to share some strategic actions across a few important dimensions in order to scale up this progress on gender justice. As a society, we're really quite good at articulating a number of challenges before us, and even conceptually some of the things that we need to do. So in other words, if we were planning a trip, we're good at saying we need to get to our destination, but I think where the challenge lies is, and for legitimate reasons, is articulating how. So what is the form of transportation? Why this and not that? What are the merits of different approaches, and how may they need to be changed depending on various circumstances? So in that sense, we're hopeful that what will be offered at this session are approaches and recommendations that can really serve to catalyze a process of learning by doing. And there's an increasing consensus around the world, at least about the direction of the trip we need to take. We now need to begin to take those iterative steps towards bringing that destination into reality. So we have a few contextual elements to today's discussion in addition to what was shared previously. First, we'll be looking through the lens of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. So there have been a number of achievements in the UN's history and still quite a long way to go. And it may be helpful just to frame our conversation in that context a little bit. Our speakers will be focusing on economic justice, climate action, and peace and security. But we also recognize that these are sort of artificial pillars, that each one really reinforces or unfortunately can cause setbacks to the others. So if there's advancement in climate, but there's a problem with peace and security, then actually the net gain is really quite limited as they are mutually reinforcing. And so all of our speakers who know this very well are artificially placed into these three pillars. So they're most welcome to comment on the others as well. And then in terms of process, I'm hopeful that the chat box and the Q&A, if we have one, we do not, it appears. So the chat box, I'm hopeful, will be very active. We've all learned at this point that really this is a value add. We can all sort of speak concurrently in these online conversations. And we have a host of people who are watching these conversations closely. And with any extra time at the end, we will surface some of those key issues for comment and response from the speakers. And then finally, I'll just ask each of the panelists, in addition to their short prepared intervention, to take a moment to respond to what you've heard from previous speaker or speakers in order to foster a more conversational atmosphere. It shouldn't just be one after the other, but really these things are integrated. So we were going to have a poll to get everybody excited and energized by clicking various buttons, but it turns out we can't poll away. So I'll just encourage you to read both the UN 75 political declaration that the member states put forward, but also the People's Declaration and Program for Action. And I'm hopeful that we'll have some links. Oh, good. See, Monique is right on top of it. We'll have some links in the chat box for both that People's Declaration and the political one. And then just take a look at them. And in case you haven't had the chance to check out the excellent lineup we have today, I will take the liberty of only briefly introducing our speakers in each of the three sections, but fuller biographies will be provided in the chat box. So the first of the pillars we'll be turning to, and my apologies for the long introduction, is on economic justice and rights action. And we'll hear from Emilia Reyes of Equidad de Género, followed by Sarah Burke from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Okay, Emilia, let me get out of your way. Please, you have the floor. Thanks.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm super happy to join you all because it's a meeting with friends and colleagues in the same struggle. Nadine, hola, ¿cómo estás? Mucho gusto. I know that the Mexican government has been having a quite tough time in organizing these in times of pandemic, so I just wanted to acknowledge that it's been a great leadership and trying to find all of the opportunities for the feminist movement to go towards the Mexican Forum and then beyond. So thank you so much for your leadership, Nadine. And thank you so much for the organizers as well. I think I'll go straight to the topic because I know we have an amazing lineup, and I'll be very happy as well to learn from my other colleagues. I just wanted to start by saying that in the context of the UN 75 anniversary, of course, we're thinking on on making an assessment of the multilateral crisis that we see on the one hand, and on the other as well, the weakening of the UN itself. We've seen how there has been a strengthening of nationalism in all around the world, and therefore the efforts of the UN to galvanize some collective action has not led to concrete initiatives that are at the level of success that we would like them to have. So that is extremely worrisome just in it by itself. So the strengthening of the UN is one of the main elements I think that we need to be mindful from here onwards. The second element, of course, on our end in Equidad de Género, but as well as in the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, we've been pointing out as well that given that the UN is under-resourced, underfunded, this means that there has been a corporate capture of the UN in which there is a programmatic plan as well based on bringing more private funding rather than strengthening the public field. And that is also a concern of us because we don't think that the solution is necessarily to turn to private sector, but really to strengthen the power of the UN in being the most universal and democratic space that there is at this time in the world, and we need to strengthen it in that spirit. So with having said that, of course, the world is facing many challenges and we need to come back to them with a global vision. So so far the challenges faced by women have been addressed as if they were micro or local or even mezzo, at the national level and at the institutional level. I think we've been very good at analyzing those linkages between the micro and the mezzo and how the local realities are being impacted as well by the action of states and institutions. But really what the feminist movement has been doing lately is, and lately I say in decades, but it's a growing knowledge, right? In highlighting how macro issues are also at the core of the demands of the women's movement, starting with, of course, the unpaid domestic and care work agenda, which is pointing out how women are actually subsidizing the entire economy. And we have these very striking figures that just last year the multi-billionaires raised $10.2 trillion just as revenue in profiting in the context of the pandemic. And as opposed to that, Oxfam has an estimation of how much value is women generating in these unpaid conditions, and it's 10.8 trillions. So we see a correlation very clearly between what has been exploited and drained out of women's efforts and what has been also exploited from the point of view of the capitalistic and neoliberal system that is predating and exacerbating the extraction of goods, of data, of the value of our work, etc. So this point of entry, that it's of course linked to the notion that women and feminists have been saying that the private is political. But also, to a larger extent, we are thinking that the Beijing Platform for Action has a section in which it is addressing in a coherent manner how environment, peace and security, the macro dimension, the real lives on the ground of women are related. And we have seen, I think, in the past years that these have been placed in silos without any connection whatsoever. So now I think it is one of our greatest challenges to look for those linkages towards the future. I mean, some members of the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition have been working in a close manner with our colleagues from Feminist Action for Climate Justice. I see my dear and admired colleague Bridget Burns is here. So we are trying to make some connections between these issues, and we also want to mainstream some of the points of entry that are also crucial for the entire action coalitions. For instance, what would be the role of the private sector in the implementation of the agenda and the blueprints that are coming out of these efforts? So we think, for instance, that the private sector is not solely an actor that is going to be interacting with us in the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, but we know there is an open and wide invitation for them to jump on board on all of these agendas. We know that the private resources is 300% more than the public funding. So of course there is a need to think about how to bring in or how to regulate and tie in the negative impacts of the private sector in human rights, in gender equality, in the environmental dimension, etc. So what we are doing is trying to think in a broader lens, how are all of these elements going to be cross-cutting to all of our actions, and at the same time to recognize that there are realities at the local, at the meso, and at the macro level, so that there is a play not only within specific issues, but also at different levels. So I just wanted, I know I have a very tight time to share with you. I mean, I invite you to join the event on Mexico, but from the point of view of the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, we're trying to explore some of the pillars that are systemic in their point of entry, but also on the impacts, and those relate, of course, to care, to access to decent employment and social protection. The other is on actual access to resources, and finally on promoting inclusive economies that is also related to transforming the international financial and economic architecture. Without that, there is no possibility really for governments or for regions to really deal with the challenge that is gender inequality. We cannot just think or expect that member states and governments with their own fiscal floors are going to solve all of the issues. We really need to move from the top of the structures, the dynamics, so that they become more democratic, so that the wealthiest economies are not deciding for the smallest and poorest countries, and also to bring in not only a feminist but also a decolonial analysis of all of these challenges, because we know that there are governments that are big important champions on some issues of the gender equality agenda, but they build on their wealth on militarized economies or by depleting and the resources in one of our countries in the global south, or by extracting fossil fuels somewhere else. So we think that there is an overall connection, and we're trying to tackle those not only by our internal agenda within the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, but as I said, initially there is this already an established effort. We called it Nexus, with the Feminist Action for Economic for Climate Justice, to start bringing in the cross-cutting points of entry, and we look forward to sharing those with you. I think my time is up, so I'm gonna stop here, and happy to hear the inputs of all of my colleagues. Thank you.
Hi, this is Sarah Burke. Dan Perrell asked me to just jump in. So thanks, Emilia, for your amazing perspective on the challenges that women are facing. And to Sun Young and Dan, and to the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan and the Coalition for the UN We Need for their kind invitation to address this roundtable on actions the UN can take to scale up progress on gender justice, especially in terms of economic justice and rights. And thanks as well to Nadine Gassman for her historic view of the process. In my work at FES, I'm often looking at the policies of the international financial institutions and the politics behind international finance for ways to make development work better for both low-income countries and middle-income countries, those caught in debt distress and unable to provide social protection or drive their own development because an unfair international tax system prevents adequate domestic resource mobilization. The need for dramatic actions in these areas, of course, has only intensified because of COVID. But for a moment, I'd like to take a step back from the financial institutions and look at what people are saying in the streets. Some of you may be aware of a study led by Isabel Ortiz, director of the Global Social Justice Program at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, back in 2013 on world protests between 2006 and 2013. The original team, of which I'm a member, has updated the research to 2020 and will be coming out with a book fairly soon. So this study looks at the demands and grievances of different protest movements. When we wrote the first paper in 2013, following a huge upsurge of anti-authoritarian protests for human and economic rights in the wake of revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, also the social protests throughout Europe that they inspired, and the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Hong Kong movements. The main demand in all these protests, which changed the debate about globalization and who gets to make decisions about people's economic lives, was for real democracy. So that was 2013. Now, 8 and more years on, financial reform to address inequalities has been stymied by financial lobbyists and other forms of political capture. During this time, Egypt's revolution was violently put down, Tunisia's has seen repeated crises, and Europe and Eurasia have been embroiled in a crisis of refugees, failed immigration policies, and armed conflict. So, with lingering economic pain due to rising living costs, poor wages, austerity cuts, and corruption, people around the world gradually lost trust in elites, in experts, in globalization, and in institutions. As we have seen all too clearly in the year of the pandemic, this situation was quickly exploited by authoritarian influencers who have effectively weaponized some of this discontent. One of our most disturbing findings has been that protests seeking to deny rights to women, to immigrants, to racial groups, ethnic groups, religious, and other groups have more than doubled from the rate they occurred back in 2013. And they have gone up more than 15 times since 2006. So this is the bad news. But the good news is that women and girls and their allies are fighting back. Protests for women's and girls' rights have increased year by year since 2010, with a significant spike from 2018 onwards. This issue has been especially relevant in the MENA region, where demands for women's rights are among the most numerous, third only to calls for jobs and wages and real democracy. So there are many protests that have taken years to achieve their goals. In Israel, protests against gender segregation and the Mahadran bus lines, which were condemned even by international diplomats, were finally overturned. In Saudi Arabia, protests against the driving ban for women finally resulted in its removal in 2018, even if one of its most vocal activists, Lujan al-Hathloul, was not released from jail until the Biden administration took office in the US. And protests for women's rights at the global level have also spiked. We can see this clearly in the International Women's Day protests, which have become increasingly massive events. Further, global solidarity around women's and girls' rights is helping to raise the pressure everywhere, such as in El Salvador's abortion rights protests or the Bring Back Our Girls protests in Nigeria. All became global protests due to the connection of social movements, which celebrated local victories as global victories, like with the recent passage of an abortion rights law in Argentina. And finally, in recent years, protests for women's rights have used more direct action and more non-traditional methods of protest. We see this in the case of the global Me Too movement, denouncing sexual harassment in social media while also pursuing legal constraints, or with Femin, in which activists reveal their naked bodies as a protest against misogyny and shaming. So, one final thought on what protests say about gender justice. If we include protests for LGBTQIA+ rights, With those for women's rights in this period that we've been looking at, they would be even more numerous, dwarfing current calls for other rights. So the story I see here is one in which the failure to achieve real economic and migration reforms in the years after the 2008-2009 financial crisis has opened up the door for repressive politics that emphasize pitting nations and groups against one another. International cooperation is urgently needed to direct the multilateral system to show that it can deliver for the people in the streets. Therefore, the recommendations I would have you consider as priority actions to address these uncorrected problems are as follows. As a top action for equity, which will benefit women, girls, and all people, especially those living in poverty, we should support the 2020 call for a global fund for social protection to enable countries to design, implement, and finance universal social protection floors, and to encourage the international financial institutions to be fully on board. International tax reform. We should join, amplify, and challenge the existing multi-stakeholder and multilateral processes to reform international taxation regulations so countries in the global system can finance inclusive social development. And debt relief. We need to double down on calls for a fair, systematic treatment of sovereign debt distress that brings the private sector on board and includes debt forgiveness. We should insist that debt discussions be coupled with discussions about how to provide new investment for inclusive social development initiatives linked to the SDGs. If we want to be prepared, as the 12th recommendation in the UN 75's declaration says that UN member states say they will be, we should take these 3 steps to transform our economic systems to provide for equitable social protection, fair taxation, and debt relief. So we'll be able to turn back the tide of countries and groups pitted against one another for these fundamental rights and needs. In the question and answer, I'm happy to talk further about how we want to measure or set time-bound goals for these actions, but I would say that they should be key components in the campaign for a new social summit before 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Emilia and Sarah. That was a wonderful start to this exploration of recommendations towards greater gender justice. I have a request actually to make of those who are in this call. There are about 75 of you, and I see many, many brilliant people, and yet I'm not hearing of your brilliance. So as Emilia and Sarah were describing a number of the current circumstances we see before us, I would imagine a lot of you were thinking of different policy proposals or recommendations or actions. I would encourage you to just put them in the chat box as ideas and concepts. We have to test these things out. And if they are perhaps imperfect, as I certainly know my ideas would be, then let's use each other to try and strengthen them and reinforce them. So, well, not reinforce the imperfection, but strengthen that, and then we can learn together. So with that, let's move straight away to our next 2 speakers, Bridget Burns from the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and Kehkechan Basu from the Green Hope Foundation, an NGO major group. They're going to speak about feminist action for climate justice. And I will give the floor right to Bridget, and then Kehkechan just pick up where Bridget leaves off when she is done. Please, you have the floor, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's really lovely to be here with all of you, many, many friends, many allies, and I really agree. I agree with Dan. It'd be wonderful to hear from the brilliance of the attendees that are here with us. And I just wanted to apologize up front that I am going to have to jump off after my intervention. So I'll look forward to following up with everyone on the dialogue that happens after this. But just quickly to say again, Bridget Burns, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based off of the unceded Lenape land, or so-called Brooklyn, calling in today. I'm the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and I am a huge lover of history, and I feel incredibly privileged to be at an organization that was also part of the Beijing Platform for Action work and working with civil society and women's organizations at that time to bring a real sense of interconnection and interlinkages between all of the different key issues that were facing gender equality and women's rights at that time and now at this time, particularly working hard to ensure that environment was centered in the outcomes of the Beijing Platform for Action. And I'm really proud now to be part of the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition. And just to say a little bit on why feminism, why feminist action, and why climate justice. So I think quite simply, we pushed for feminist action for climate justice because we're really talking about systemic change that's needed. And when we talk about what systems change looks like, we know it requires delivering on climate justice, recognizing not only the injustice and the causes of climate change, but the real injustice and inequalities in who is facing the impacts of climate change. And I've said this quote many times over the last week or so when talking about this action coalition, but Bella said at one time, Bella Abzug, who is the co-founder of We Do, that women do not simply want to be mainstreamed into a polluted stream. We want to change the stream, make it clean and green and safe for all, every gender, race, creed, sexual orientation, age, and ability. And I think for me, that's a really important quote that sums up the spirit of our action coalition in the type of system change that we're calling for. And we have set ourselves, we're working through the blueprint right now, but we've set ourselves a vision. And I have to just reiterate what Amelia said and what other colleagues have said on this call. The real indistinguishable nature of the 6 action coalitions and how they really reinforce and must work together. And as Amelia said, we've worked quite closely with the Action Coalition on Economic Justice because part of a push for a more inclusive, regenerative, circular, care-based economy is really shifting our economic system. And we want that to be deeply reflected in our action coalition. And that requires issues around trade justice, tax justice, debt sovereignty, all of which are critical to having the fiscal space in countries, across communities, to be able to invest in gender just climate solutions, essentially. So we'd like to see as an action coalition that over the next 5 years, we're able through this blueprint to initiate a just transition to that inclusive and regenerative green economy that recognizes the interconnectedness of climate change with issues of gender justice and protects and amplifies the voices of grassroots and indigenous communities, including frontline defenders, many of whom are put in enormous peril in the fight that they take to preserve our lands and our communities, and across social and political arenas. We think that looks like a huge increase in women and girls in their full diversity to be able to equitably and meaningfully participate in decision-making processes at all levels. Feels like we've been pushing for that for many, many years. And I think that what we want to see is a real shift, a sea change in not only the type of leadership that we have across all of these issues, but really in feminist leadership and feminist governance. We want to also see financing institutions and the donor community reframing issues such as risk, which is long-standing in terms of the international instruments that we participate in, where a project that is aimed at promoting livelihoods is seen as a greater risk than one that's retrofitting a dam, for example. This is really old world, antiquated thinking that needs to be shifted in order to be able to create the kind of society and shift finances towards the kinds of solutions that we know women and girls, particularly Indigenous and grassroots women and girls, are leading around the world. We want to hold both financing institutions as well as the private sector accountable to shifting capital in a way that supports resilient societies and transformative investments in gender just climate-based, gender just solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. And we want to see the full diversity of leadership in accessing climate finance, technologies, and knowledge, access and control over natural resources, for the management and protection of land, including through securing land rights and ownership. And so you'll see in our blueprint right now, we have 4 very broad action areas around, first, increasing direct access to financing for gender just climate solutions, in particular to women and girls at grassroots levels, to enabling women and girls in all their diversity to lead a just transition to an inclusive, circular, regenerative green economy, to build the resilience of women and girls to climate impacts, disaster risks, loss and damage, including through land rights and tenure security. And then finally, one thing that we've highlighted as critical and that we think is important for our work over these next 5 years and advocacy is to increase the collection and the use of gender and of data at the gender and environment nexus, so that we can really see the measure progress in a way that is supporting impact, as opposed to progress that is perhaps just ticking the box. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Kekishan to walk through what some of these actions look like and some of the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and hello, everyone. Once again, I'm Kekisha. Good afternoon from Toronto, Canada. And as all of my panelists have mentioned, gender justice is deeply intertwined in human rights and the decade of action, because without it, we cannot achieve Agenda 2030 nor any other form of development. The needs and aspirations of 1/2 of humanity cannot continue to be ignored and trampled, and they must be given the due focus and attention that even today is starkly lacking, the severity of which once again comes to the fore, as my fellow panelists stated, in times of conflict, strife, and stress, as we've witnessed in these last 12 months, with women and girls suffering the most from the impacts of the pandemic. And our inequity is spread across multiple dimensions. It's now proven beyond a doubt that gender justice is deeply linked to climate justice. As Bridget just mentioned, it's not only the direct impact of climate change-induced disasters or conflict over land-based rights. Women and girls continue to face marginalization with regard to all remedial measures of climate education, access to funding, and in-kind resources in climate vulnerable areas. And the situation on the ground is far worse than what little makes it in the mainstream media reporting. Now, as someone who works at the grassroots in 25 countries, most of which are either LDCs or deeply conservative and vulnerable regions, I have seen this firsthand, the plight of women and girls in affected areas, from the Sundarbans that was torn apart by Cyclone Isla and most recently Cyclone Amphan, to the Amazon rainforest. And I continue to be inspired by their strength, given that the burden of rebuilding their communities after these disasters also falls on them, as they manage the community's nexus of food, water, and shelter. During the pandemic, my team at Green Hope Foundation and I have been working in Bangladesh's COVID-affected communities that also got ravaged by monsoon flooding. And we're implementing scalable, local, circular bioeconomies through skills training and livestock distribution. We're enabling the women to become entrepreneurs, thereby ensuring a climate-smart, women-led regenerative solution that uplifts their society. In speaking today as the regional organizing partner for North America and on behalf of the NGO Major Group, I can state, based on my experiences of working at a grassroots level for the last decade, that the burden of rebuilding better and ensuring equitable access on the ground is driven by NGOs and other civil society actors. And it's their diverse and tireless work on the ground to ensure the functioning of society from the bottom up that in most cases is the only healing balm available to the affected populace. And while policymakers debate, the conversions of their policies to reality is carried forward by the NGOs who risk at times their lives for the cause of humanity, And even amongst these crusaders, those who face the most risk, as Bridget also mentioned, are, of course, women and girls. And this inequality continues to be perpetuated by the lack of gender data, as these data gaps both reflect and maintain gender inequality. And while they persist, they slow action and make the intersectional gender inequality and its human impacts harder to see and harder to address. All of this adds up to the fact that gender justice is intrinsically linked to human rights, with multidimensional components intertwined through climate impacts, biodiversity loss, migration, and therefore at the core of every SDG. Now, at the NGO Major Group, we recognize these challenges and have long called for the need for transformative change that puts the unique needs of women and girls at the forefront of the global agenda to challenge the hegemonic ways of addressing climate justice. But we cannot continue our work unless we have the support necessary to bring about change, to get our voices heard in all of our diversity, to ensure gender justice, climate justice, and human rights. And so as we progress in this last decade of action, these are the 3 key recommendations that we would propose. So number 1, guarantee civic space. Too many CSOs, human rights, and environmental defenders are under threat, excluded, and persecuted in a growing number of countries around the world, including major democracies like Brazil and India. The core rights to freedom of assembly, association, and expression must be guaranteed. And using state power to silence us must be unequivocally condemned by the UN, and it must use all its influence to impose measures and sanctions on erring states to prevent it from proliferating. And the UN can also lead the way by opening up space in its own processes, as we are currently calling for with the government of Denmark as part of the Unmute Civil Society initiative that demands actions on bridging the digital divide, ensuring meaningful engagement in key steps at the UN, and a call for a special envoy for civil society engagement across all UN processes. The second point, provide clearer and time-bound funding for the frontline. The discussions on the recovery process have unanimously highlighted a clear need for equitable financing. And my fellow panelists have covered the importance of macroeconomic redistribution, but we would also stress the importance of ensuring direct funding is available to frontline communities. And the rise in digital and online engagement means that it is now actually more realistic to track and ensure funds can reach local groups directly. As part of our digital strategy, we are collaboratively developing an online platform called Zovu that will enable local stories to be shared directly. And this is being developed together with key community groups for launch in September. And the third and final recommendation, decarbonize and protect our world. The process of rebuilding better cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. It must accelerate the change to a more just, inclusive, and sustainable world that we've all been working towards over recent years. And as countries look towards recovery, we have a huge opportunity to build a different economic model, one that moves away from the grossly inefficient and unjust linear model of consumption and production, and one that's based on a transformative shift to a zero carbon economy. And any economic stimulus packages agreed upon by the G7, G20, or IMF must be based on a fundamental realignment of our industries and economies away from fossil fuels and towards a renewable and regenerative future. So creating the new normal requires bold actions, the nucleus of which definitely must be on gender and humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both Bridget and Kehkashan for those remarks. They're very, very helpful. And we can clearly see this interconnectedness of all the different dimensions of gender equality and climate change and macroeconomic issues. It's really helpful to have this exploration, as well as a number of these recommendations, which I hope we can further unpack. And thank you also to the participants who are putting more and more into the chat box. I see suggestions around taxes and budgets and civil society participation. Hopefully there will be more that will be generated as Alan and Mavic are able to foster more creative thinking. So we will turn now to them. Mavic Cabrera Baeza is from the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, and Alan Ware is from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and they'll be focusing on gender-based violence and peace and security, which are not going to be fully addressed in a few minutes, but I'm sure we'll get a lovely taste. So Mavic, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thanks to the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan, the Coalition for the UN We Need, and all of the organizers of this very important and timely discussion. My name is Mavic Cabrera Baeza. I am the founder and chief executive officer of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders and a board member of the Generation Equality Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action. I just need to give a very brief introduction of the compact. In the beginning, or up to the middle of the discussions on the Generation Equality Forum, the Women, Peace and Security and Youth Peace and Security agendas and gender-responsive humanitarian response were not included as one of the action coalitions, even though women and youth peace builders and humanitarian actors were actively involved in all of the discussions on the Generation Equality Forum. In response, our organization, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, coordinated the successful civil society advocacy for the integration of the Women, Peace and Security and Youth Peace and Security agendas and gender-responsive humanitarian response, which led to the establishment of the Generation Equality Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action, which was formally announced during the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in October of last year. Now, what is the compact? The Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action is a partnership and coordinating mechanism, which, like the action coalitions, is one of the outcomes of the Generation Equality Forum that will drive change in the next 5 years. It just have a different configuration in terms of the composition and some modalities of our work. The compact will focus on financing, monitoring, and accountability for existing policies and commitments on women, peace and security and humanitarian actions, including regional action plans, national action plans, and local action plans, and peace agreements. There are 5 working groups under the compact. The first one is financing the Women, Peace and Security agenda and gender equality and humanitarian programming. I'd like to share a couple of data. In 2019, the total global military spending reached $1.9 trillion. Compare that with 0.2% of funding for women peace builders who are working on conflict prevention and peace building in local communities, 0.2% out of a total of annual average of 96 million for all of the funds for fragile states. So a big chunk of that, of course, goes to government and UN entities and other multilateral organizations. The second working group within the compact is women's meaningful participation in peace processes, including implementation of peace agreements. As we all know, more than 50% of peace agreements are easily violated even before the ink that was used to sign them has dried. The third working group is women's economic security, access to resources, and other essential services. The fourth working group is women's leadership and agency across peace, security, and humanitarian sectors. And fifth but not the least, is protection of women peace builders, including women human rights defenders in conflict and crisis contexts. Now, moving on to the recommendations, I know we don't have a lot of time. To maximize the increased cross-fertilization and our collective impact, my first recommendation is to allocate accessible, reliable, timely, long-term, and core funding for diverse civil society, including especially grassroots women's rights and youth organizations, by facilitating the creation of an increased investment in funding mechanisms to support this work. The second recommendation is to generate political will among member states to address structural inequalities such as limited access to education, childcare burdens, and lack of funds to travel to participate in peace negotiations, for example, that inhibit women's meaningful participation and leadership in peace processes. The third recommendation is to launch communication campaigns to define women's leadership and its connectedness to local and national movements, and emphasize the diversity of women and young women perspectives. We, the including our colleagues in the United Nations, governments, and of course, our fellow civil society actors still tend to talk in our echo chambers. And that's why the emphasis on effective communication campaigns. As it is, very few people are aware of the Generation Equality Forum and the Compact on Women, Peace, and Security. So how can anyone participate in something they're not even aware of? Along this line, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, in partnership with the Permanent Mission of Mexico and the Permanent Mission of Namibia, as well as many women's rights organizations and networks, including the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, we will be organizing a workshop on March 26 from 8 to 10 in the morning, US Eastern Daylight Time or New York time. So please mark that on your calendar, and I will be sharing the link to register on the chat box. The workshop will include discussions with the civil society leads in the different action coalitions, because this is an effort in ensuring our intersectional, integrative, and inclusive work. After all, we cannot achieve gender equality and gender justice for everyone if there are ongoing violent conflicts. And on the flip side, we cannot have just and peaceful society if gender equality and gender justice are not a lived reality for everyone. Thank you.
So hello everybody, my name's Alan Ware and I'm with Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and the World Future Council, and I'm going to be looking at gender, peace and disarmament from inclusion and protection of rights through political transformation. I'm going to be drawing from, firstly, let me say how informative and inspiring the other speakers have been, and it's been a great privilege to be invited to this session and to learn so much from others, and this will inspire us to be more engaged with others as well. I'm going to be drawing in my presentation from both the UN 75 Declaration and UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and focusing particularly on a couple of areas. From the UN 75 Declaration, looking at key points that armed conflict must be resolved through peaceful means, that the diplomatic toolbox of the UN must be used to prevent, or better used, to prevent and resolve conflicts on land, at sea, in space and in cyberspace. Arms control and non-proliferation disarmament agreements must be upheld and implemented, and equal participation of women is required for sustainable solutions to conflicts and implementation of disarmed agreements. And from UN Security Council Resolution 1325, focusing on the three key aspects: participation of women, attention to the impact of armed conflict on women and girls, and the inclusion of gender perspectives and approaches. I'm going to concentrate primarily on the third one because that's the one that's probably least understood. So abroad, the PND, our network of parliamentarians, has launched a revamped gender, peace and security program, and we're focusing on 3 key aspects of the gender approach: the inclusion of different sexes in program activities, the impact of armed conflict on women and girls, and here's the one which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on: the incorporation of different gender approaches to security in social and political systems. This means including human security, environmental security, and common security as complementary to national and military security in order to achieve comprehensive and sustainable security. Phew, that's a lot of securities. So just to sort of explain those very briefly, so human security is placing human needs at the center. Environmental security is ensuring a sustainable environment. Common security is framing security approaches so there's security for all entities, particularly countries, through conflict resolution and the law. So it's using an us and them approach rather than an us versus them approach. National security is security of the state and territory. Military security is security through the threat or use of force. And comprehensive security includes consideration of the whole range of security needs, and the sustainable security is security solution time. So here we're looking at the gender, the engagement of gender in those different security aspects. And as I mentioned, a gender approach is basically inclusive of those. I'm going to pick 2 key goals from the UN 75 Declaration. That's the abolition of war and the elimination of nuclear weapons. We've added time-bound objectives to achieve these by 2045, the 100th anniversary of the UN, and focus on gender, peace and security relations to those goals. So I'll just give a few examples just to illustrate approaches, focusing on the 3 different aspects: inclusion of women, impact on women, and political transformation. I'll look at the Bougainville Peace Crisis, Bougainville Peace Process, World Future Council highlighting of effective policies, engaging women legislators and gender frameworks through legislative processes, and then highlighting the role of the UN through Unfold Zero. These are just illustrative examples, and then I'll finish with 3 recommendations. So the Bougainville Peace Process, this is a clear example of the importance of engaging women in peace negotiations and peace processes at all levels. This was a 10-year civil war. It was stimulated by an environmental conflict, a mine which was leaking poisons into the waterways, and the lack of attention to the environmental issues that were raised led to the civil war. Many failed peace attempts trying to just negotiate with the combatants for both sides. Success was achieved once women were brought into the peace negotiations. And then the interesting thing is the peacekeeping force, which was implementing the peace agreement, was an unarmed one. So it provided a different application of military force. Rather than using the force of weapons, it used the force of culture. The soldiers went in with guitars and songs and Maori culture, actually, because it was the New Zealand peacekeeping force. It's a wonderful movie about the soldiers without guns where you can see the whole story. The next bit is highlighting effective policies. It's really important not just to criticize what's there or push for what we would like to be there, but also to highlight what is already in existence in terms that's incorporating some of these issues. So I focus particularly on the Future Policy Awards, which the World Future Council has put forward, and the 2 ones which are most relevant here are 2013, the Future Policy Award was on disarmament, and 2014, it was on ending violence against women and girls. And I don't have time to go through all the effective policies which the award highlighted. I encourage you to go online to look at those. But just it's very important, as I said, to highlight that there are effective policies that are working. We often don't hear very much about them. And so highlighting these is very, very important. Now I'll look at the engagement of parliamentarians. And again, this is where my organization, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, is taking a very active role, including through a specific gender, peace and security program. Here's one example of one of the activities, a global women's appeal on May 24th last year, commemorating the International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament, and also the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Now, it did put forward the importance of inclusion and inclusion of women, and the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. But it also looked at the security frameworks, which I had mentioned earlier, to have a more inclusive and effective and sustainable approach to security. And some of those key points in the statement, which was signed by not only legislators, but also women religious leaders and women civil society leaders, was to cut military budgets and reallocate these to public health, peace and sustainable development, support the United Nations and its agencies to better manage global issues and advance human security, promote securing our common future, which was a disarmed agenda released by the UN Secretary General in 2018 that also made the connections between disarmament and sustainable development and human rights, including the rights of women, support the UN Secretary General's initiative for a global ceasefire, and encourage governments to better utilise the UN mechanisms for resolving conflicts and achieving security without reliance on the threat or use of force. Now, the last one, that we can have security without the threat or use of force, is the one that's sometimes hard to sell to governments or to what we call political realists, who I don't think are political realists, who believe that you have to rely on the threat or use of force and strong militaries. So we need to emphasize examples of common security and human security mechanisms working. And I'll just quickly give two examples from my area, from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we had security conflicts, concerns, and they were addressed to a more powerful country than ourselves, France. One was the French Secret Service blowing up our peace boat, the Rainbow Warrior, in our harbour. And after we caught agents, France put an economic boycott on New Zealand. So we were the weak country and France was the powerful country. But we used the mediation services of the United Nations to resolve the conflict and restore a good relationship between New Zealand and France. So now we only fight with France on the rugby field. And it's all in good spirits. Another one, which again was with France, was the nuclear tests. This time we used the International Court of Justice, both in 1975 and again in 95, which helped end the nuclear testing in the Pacific. So those are two examples from my country on nuclear weapons issues, but it goes beyond that. There are so many examples of, for example, the International Court of Justice working to resolve conflicts which had been armed conflict or the threat or use of force. And this is just a sample of some of the ones. I don't have time to go through them, but these demonstrate that common security, human security approaches can work and are better than military security in most cases. So lastly, I mentioned Unfold Zero. We've put forward a platform called Unfold Zero in order to educate people and engage in the important role of the UN and mechanisms to end war and abolish nuclear weapons. And we have an appeal on that, which is still open, so anyone can endorse this. And this appeal is used to educate and engage and reinforce the UN roles with three key calls: affirm that we cannot fight or win a nuclear war, so we have to stand down nuclear forces. We need to eliminate the nuclear weapons, and we need to cut the nuclear weapons budgets and investments and redirect these to UN and to sustainable development and to protecting the climate. So finally, the recommendations, and it draws from some of what I've mentioned before. With regards to military budgets, so Mavic mentioned the global military budget is currently 1.9 trillion. If we could cut this by 5% per year for the next 5 years, we would have sufficient funds then, and relocate this to COVID-19 recovery, climate protection, human rights and sustainable development. We would have enough to meet the sustainable development goals. And the other two recommendations is the elimination of nuclear weapons by 2045 and increasing the number of countries accepting compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, because this is the primary mechanism for common security, resolving conflicts through law rather than through the threat or use of force. We should double the number of countries who accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Mavic and Alan for really sort of tying a nice bow on how all of these things are interrelated. There are a number of themes that seem to come through loudly in everybody's presentations. And I'm very grateful to you for getting really specific into the recommendations and the aspirations. So now there have been a couple of questions in the chat box. And I also came with a couple of questions myself, I think, that have been further deepened and reinforced after listening to you all. So what I'll do is, with your permission, I'll just articulate two broad questions, and I think a couple we've heard in the chat box or read in the chat box fit under these. And then just open the floor to any of the six speakers to offer their reflections. And I'm saying six because Bridget had to depart, and Dr. Gassman, of course, is always welcome to recontribute as she sees fit. So the two questions that I ask are one on process and one on substance. So there has been a lot of really helpful information about the processes about making these things happen, the need for data, the need for wide participation, open civil society space, the need for political will. My question is, what is the key added value of a gender equal approach to these processes? I have my own thoughts, but this isn't my platform. So secondly, you've spoken a lot about substance, this idea of rethinking the economic order, the sort of the fundamental shifts that we need. This has been articulated through specific suggestions like funding for certain groups, frontline movements and all of this, but also through broader suggestions like global tax bodies and global social protection fund. But my question in this area is about the qualitative difference that we hope to see as we approach this question of substance through a gender lens once again. I think that we know that there, intrinsically that there may be some difference, but I'm hoping to maybe tease that out a bit more. And I have sort of a sub question on this one, which is about the artificial link that has been created between having a job and having a livelihood, like the need to have produced something in the traditional sense in order to earn money, which is required to live. So I'm curious if that model is still the model that we should be living with, or if there are other models that we may wish to approach. So those are the two questions, one on process and one on substance, and both through the lens of gender equality. And if any of our speakers would like to jump in, you are most welcome to do so. Otherwise, I may just pick out of a hat. So I'll give you a moment to raise a hand if you'd like to jump in. Please, Emilia, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all of the panelists with very relevant presentations. I wanted to go back to some elements related to your questions, but are more reflective of the current context. So far, the UN has some spaces to discuss issues on economic justice and rights, such as the financing for development or UNCTAD's process. However, many of the decisions are made in other spaces like the G7, the G20, the Paris Club, the OECD, etc. Many of the things that have been mentioned here about debt cancellation or about global tax convention, etc. And it is, I think, in this innovative space in which there is some room to try to bring in some strings from those scattered places. Of course, the FFD group and the Women's Working Group on FFD has been also calling for a Monterrey Plus conference that is a follow-up to Addis, and is a crisis conference that is, again, not only addressing the issues on financing, but really about the normative settings in which our international architecture is dealing with the pressing problems of our times. So we hope that is a thing that I invite you to stay tuned in with the FFD process. But as a whole, the point of entry of gender equality is crucial. I mean, we've seen that in the CEDAW committee, they have been willing to address some structural issues such as taxation or as illicit financial flows. And they're saying that, illicit financial flows, but also on fossil fuel extractions. And what they're saying is that all of those actions by developed countries are really depleting the capacity of countries of the global south to really spend the maximum amount of resources in ensuring women's human rights. So this is also about extraterritorial obligations and impacts. So my point being is that we've seen that there is already an experience in the world that the point of entry of gender equality and women's human rights can be a starting point for mobilizing different situations that otherwise is very hard to see in the systemic approach. So I want to also push back against some isolated measures that are only dealing with specific policies at the country level or at the regional level, because I was saying the challenge of women's human rights and gender equality is macro and therefore needs complex and sophisticated solutions, as we have heard from the panelists here. So that is one thing that to me is also relevant in order to start challenging the usual positions of member states. We've seen that there is a huge struggle within the WTO on intellectual property rights for vaccines and medical supplies, treatments, and medical technologies. And that, for the point of view of some experts in civil society, that has been called a genocide and crimes against humanity. So we will see how that discussion is followed. But within the WTO, there are legal arguments that say that these are issues that necessarily have to be addressed from the point of view of the internal language of the WTO. There are provisions that said that in exceptional situations there has to be a waiver on the intellectual property rights. And just last week the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights released a statement saying how it is really extremely important to promote the TRIPS waiver. I mean, not in these words, I'm happy to share with you the draft, the statement, but it's really a call for going beyond the political will or on the status quo, on the existing interest, and really address the fundamental issues. And I want to emphasize as well that within the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, we want to reject the notion that this is a negotiation, and the same way that negotiations are happening in the UN. This is not a negotiations. We're not going to go with agreed language. We're not going to be reviewing what has been stated in this. No, we need to really have a sophisticated framing of thinking, and we really need to bring in all of the voices that are around the world, and it's gonna take us time. So I on my end, I didn't stop to present what we have done with the blueprint, because I don't think it is on our end to state the agenda. These have been starting points that we just drafted, and we look forward to hearing from the movement in the next weeks and months to see how we can make this richer, and that is part of the process. But on the other hand, we do have a vision. We are not willing to go to be subjected to the type of dynamics that happen in usual negotiations, because this is really a process that we want to take ownership as feminists. So I just wanted to say as well, there are many proposals out there, like the Global Fund for Social Protection. Some of our members in the Women's Working Group are proposing that. The Women's Working Group has not have a position yet, because we think that we need to first really mobilize the entire global architecture. Just adding another fund without really touching the global architecture is just adding another fund that has no real solutions, as we have seen even with the largest fund in the humanity, which is the Green Climate Fund. So this is why we really need to think big. We need to think about systemic reforms, and that is what we're trying to do from the Economic Justice and Rights. We are hearing all of the proposals, but to us, this is an opportunity, and the feminist movement has all the tools to really go at the heart of the problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. So we're going to turn very quickly, abbreviated comments, if you could, to Mavic, then straight to Kekachan, then to Alan, who wants to answer a question that came up in the chat, and then Dr. Gassman, you've raised and lowered your hand, so you can jump in, and then we'll turn straight over to Soon-Young. Actually, Sarah, I see you may wish to respond. So why don't we just go quickly with Mavic, Kekachan, and then Alan. Very brief, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. The dominant images of women in situations of conflict are still those of victims. But we want to emphasize as women peace builders that they are not passive victims. They are mediators, negotiators, peace builders, and they see the economic inequalities, the impact of climate change, and several other major issues as the root causes of conflict. And they have profound understanding about these root causes, and they have practical solutions. So there are two reasons why gender equality perspective is very important and has a very strong value added. Women's rights and gender equality are recognized under international law, the 10 Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, CEDAW, the national laws. In our research, most countries have an average of 4 national laws on women's rights and gender equality, but those are still remaining only on paper. They're not recognized as there's a difference between de facto and the de jure. So it is a right, but also the other important point is women present practical solutions that have been tested. So to sum up, it's both the right thing to do under the law, and it's a smart thing to do to ensure that women are meaningfully participating in decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Kekishan.
Thank you. And first of all, completely agree with Mavic. And, you know, a gender equal approach enables us to view the unique challenge, view and understand the unique challenges that women and girls face in all of our diversity, as well as recognize the unique leadership approaches that we bring to the table. And it ensures the meaningful engagement of people, regardless of their gender. And gender equality has been a fundamental part of the sustainable development process right from 1992, part of the MDGs, SDGs. And as I mentioned earlier, as one half of the human race, any discussion on development or any other agenda is incomplete and irrelevant if it does not address the issues of gender. And even today, we continue to suffer from bias and inequality in all aspects of our lives. And once again, our leadership approaches are in many places still ignored. So whether it's climate change, biodiversity loss, or the COVID pandemic, the impacts on us anyway are disproportionately higher. So honestly, it should not even be a point up for a debate anymore. It's critical to address all aspects of development from the gender lens. Otherwise, it will not be sustainable at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to the question from Jeffrey Huffings in the chat, which was how can we persuade members of P5 to take human security and common security more seriously? And I'll say in 2 key ways. One is to appeal to them and use the avenues and forums open to that, and 2, put pressure on them. So for example, appeal, we can use Security Council to put pressure on the P5. Any non-permanent member of the Security Council can raise a resolution, can call on implementation on, for example, UN Security Resolution 1325, or on implementation of Article 26 of the UN Charter, which Costa Rica did when they had the presidency, which is the obligation to cut the investments in the weapons in order to provide resources for economic and social development. But it's only so far you can go with the Security Council, because the P5 all have veto power and they all have vested interests in the arms race. They all have huge weapons industries. So we have to go beyond just appealing through the Security Council process and take it sort of, I guess, more out onto the streets. 3 key ways of doing that. 1, with the parliaments and legislatures. There are really committed parliamentarians in all or most of the P5 countries who want to take these issues forward, some with more capacity than the other. The UK and the US is very transparent. We've got ones already. For example, just this week, the UK launched a pretty retrogressive defence policy, which increased the role of nuclear weapons to deal with possible threats in cyberspace. Instantly, the parliamentarians started challenging the UK government on that. We have in the US also some very good legislators who are pushing for, this is the 10% caucus, a 10% reduction in the US military budget, which is the biggest in the world, in order to fund COVID protection, etc. So parliaments. Second one is through officials, government officials, and a wonderful way of doing that is through the periodic review of human rights treaties, because in that process you are actually engaging with officials of governments who generally do want to do good. And so you're bypassing the politics at the top and getting through and finding allies within these P5 countries. And finally, divestment. We have to address the industrial support for the fossil fuels. We have to divest from fossil fuel industry. We have to divest from the arms industry, from the nuclear weapons industry. Stop, whether it's our bank, whether it's our university, whether it's our religious institution, our city, or in our government, sovereign wealth funds, we can stop all those from investing in those industries and investing in sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was going to give the floor to Dr. Gassman, but I think that she's no longer with us. If that's the case, I would just like to say thank you very much for the honor of being here with you. I'll hand the floor now to Soon Young for some final wrap-up comments, please.
Let's wrap up comments then saying how important it is that we had this group together. I hope that those of you who are attending were able to see the cross relationships between these particular three action coalitions, but do take a look at all six. Do sign up for the virtual meeting the 29th to the 31st in Mexico, because the action coalitions will then be officially launched. Do stay in touch with the Global Compact on Women, Peace and Security as a really important interlinkage with all the others. I would just like to thank Dan for a great moderation and all the panelists. To close our session, I would invite you to think about which of the action coalitions you might wish to join at some point. And if you want to make a commitment in the chat as we say goodbye, that would be great. You can write, I commit to working with Alan on nuclear disarmament and with Mavic in her work and with the other panelists as well. So let's say goodbye to each other and thank you all so much. Posting a video will be on YouTube, and Alan, we need your PowerPoint. We will post that on the FW Map exhibit hall space. If you send it to us, we'll do that right away.
Thank you, everyone.